Hej, det är hyggligt att vara här i Porsgrunn. Jag kommer från Storbritannien, jag bor nu i Sverige, så det är möjligt att vi prövar snacka lite skandinaviska tillsammans, men jag kommer snacka engelska nu. As you've heard, a writer. I'm not an academic or a scholar particularly. I work a lot with artists of different kinds. I've spent the last 2 years working as konstnärlig och publikutvecklingsledare with Riksteatern in Sweden. And I've written a lot about the relationship between art and the mess that the world is in, and what it is that we can do as artists. Today, that's not what I'm going to be focusing on, but it seems worth saying that because I know that it's something that's very relevant to a lot of you. And yes, as you heard, I'm also one of the founders of Dark Mountain, which is, amongst other things, a journal that brings together the work of artists and writers and thinkers who are attempting to confront the mess that the world is in from a cultural perspective. This is the 11th book that we've published. And the picture on the front of it actually comes from an art project on Svalbard. And there are several Norwegian contributors, I think, in this issue. So, but what I want to do now is talk about something called the Commons. 50 years ago, the only people talking about the Commons were historians of early modern England. The word referred to those pastures in England on which villagers each kept a few sheep. The equivalent here would be allmänning. It was a historical phenomenon, a part of the way in which people lived, part of the landscape in the area of a village which was not owned privately by individuals, but owned collectively by the people dwelling there. So, if you heard anyone talk about the Commons, they were talking about that historical mode of living with the landscape, and probably about the enclosure of the Commons, the process by which that kind of use of and relationship to land was forcibly brought to an end. One of my teachers, Anthony McCann, summarises this. He says, the enclosures were a series of changes to the English landscape between the 15th and the 19th centuries, often entailed the changing of agricultural practices from communally administered landholdings, usually in fields which didn't have physically defined territorial boundaries, to agricultural holdings which were non-communal. Common lands were enclosed by man-made boundaries that separated one farm from another. And the story of how that happened, the story of how the historical commons were taken away from people, has been treated by economic historians as a very important part of the journey into modernity, into industrial society. And depending on what kind of political and economic perspective you have, it can be a positive or a negative story about that development. If you read Marx, a large chunk of volume 1 of Capital is taken up with the history of what happened to the commons in England, which he calls primitive accumulation. The process which lays the foundation for the forms of accumulation which then characterize the modern capitalist economies he was describing in countries like England by the middle of the 1800s. So, that's where we were 50 years ago. The commons was something that was talked about by economic historians. Today, commons is a key word in a whole string of different but sometimes interlocking debates. And roughly in chronological order, those are Firstly, the environmental commons. There is a conversation now which didn't exist 50 years ago about the sea, the air, the water table under the ground as commons, using this word which is taken from the history of land use. Then, more recently, the information commons or the digital commons. So people who are involved and active within free culture, free software movements, people who are arguing for the sharing of files free online, talk about commons. And they talk about how these digital commons are non-scarce commodities. If I copy a music file off you, it's not theft in the same way as walking into a shop and picking up a can of beans and walking out without paying it is theft, because I haven't taken anything away from you. You still have the file, and I have it too. So in that world of the politics of the internet, there is a conversation about the commons going on. And then you have the emergence of the commons in a political context. If you look at movements like the Indignados in Spain, and a lot of the other kind of grassroots political movements that have grown up since the 2008 global financial crisis, particularly the movements that became very visible in 2011, where people were connecting over the internet often to organize in a new way, but also meeting in occupying spaces in the middle of cities. And in that new political language, there is a lot of talk about the commons, the experience of occupying a square in Athens or Madrid or Istanbul or New York City as being like a commons that you create together, and the right to the city, the idea that our cities should be more like commons. And also that use of, that emergence of the commons as a key word for that kind of politics, I think, reflects a loss of faith in the state and in the achievements of social democracy and socialism in the 20th century. So people who 30 years ago would have been talking in much more top-down language about the need to take control of the state through democracy or other means in order to reform or revolutionize society in order to make society fairer. You find a lot of those people today are speaking this language of the commons because it is a kind of post-modern language, I guess, a sort of new left-wing politics that reflects an experience of disillusionment. So there are all of these conversations about the commons going on that would have been quite hard to imagine 50 years ago. One consequence of this is that sometimes all of this is kind of put together under one banner and talked about as a kind of commons movement, where everybody who is speaking enthusiastically about the commons is basically in the same boat. We're all together creating, building a vision of a new way of living together. Alternatively, if you go to conferences where people are talking about the commons, you sometimes find that there is actually a kind of political split, where on the one hand you have a kind of commons-oriented politics of the left that is very much translating traditions that come from Marxism or from social democracy into a new language of the commons, and on the other hand you have a more libertarian politics of the commons that is inspired by the experience of the internet and is more focused on individual freedom. And you could think of the overlapping of those two politics of the commons being represented by the strange relationship between the Occupy movement and Anonymous. And we know now that 4chan and these parts of internet culture out of which Anonymous came were among the supporters of Donald Trump in the US election. But if you go back to 2011, if you were in Zuccotti Park, you would see people with the the Guy Fawkes anonymous mask on, sitting there talking to anarchists and socialists in this same space of the occupied public space. So there's something curious there. That's not what I really want to talk about today, though. What I want to do is to emphasize a different fault line within these conversations about the commons, which is more fundamental, which runs through all of these domains, the environmental, the cultural and technological, the political, in which new talk about the commons has been bubbling up. And it's a fault line, a divide between two irreconcilably different ways of seeing the world, both of which currently go under the language of the commons. And to talk about ways of seeing the world might sound passive. It's about, it sounds like being an observer rather than a participant. But as Uwe was saying, there's a huge power in how we see the world, because how we see the world, the lenses through which we see the world, determines our sense of what is possible. So, to go back 50 years, this return of the commons, this thing where the commons come out of the history books and begin to become a part of conversations today, how does it start? It starts in 1968 with an environmental economist, you might say, called Garrett Hardin, who wrote a very famous essay or paper called The Tragedy of the Commons. It was an essay about the population problem, and he drew on the earlier work of an English economist from 1833, William Foster Lloyd, and he gives an example, which is partly borrowed from Lloyd, about what happens when landscape, or whatever it is you're talking about, sea, water, is owned in common. It says, picture a pasture that is open to all. It is to be expected that each herdsman will try to keep as many cattle as possible on the commons. As a rational being, each herdsman seeks to maximize his gain. Explicitly or implicitly, more or less consciously, he asks, what is the utility to me of adding one more animal to my herd? This utility has one negative and one positive component. The positive component is a function of the increment of one animal. Since the herdsman receives all the proceeds from the sale of the additional animal, the positive utility is nearly +1. The negative component is a function of the additional overgrazing created by one more animal. Since, however, the effects of the overgrazing are shared by all of the herdsmen using the commons, not just the one who has put his own animal onto it, the negative utility is only a fraction of -1. Adding together the component partial utilities, the rational herdsman concludes that the only sensible course for him to pursue is to add another animal to his herd. And another, and another. But this is the conclusion reached by each and every rational herdsman sharing a commons. Therein is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit, in a world that is limited. Ruin is the destination toward which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. It's a very dark, pessimistic picture of what happens when we attempt to have things in common. The argument that he's making, in that strange language that economists of the dominant school tend to speak in, the argument that he's making is that it's necessary to privatize the commons or to have them owned and controlled by the state in order to save us from ourselves. If we're left to ourselves and attempt to share and graze our animals on a commons outside the village, it will end in disaster. That article is one of the most cited academic papers ever. I checked it last night on Google. It currently has 33,399 citations. There is a problem with that article, which has been pointed out repeatedly but doesn't stop people citing it, which is that we actually have a lot of evidence of what happens when people share a commons, because it's something, whether it was the commons in England or the ejido in Mexico or the almenning in Norway, it's something that we have done a lot in human history. And on the whole, it doesn't end in the kind of disaster that is described in Hardin's fantasy of the commons. There is a human capacity for self-limitation and self-governance, for figuring things out between us. But the herdsmen in Hardin's fantasy of the commons are not humans. They are another species, Homo economicus, that acts on a set of motivations which mainstream economics claims are what it's like to be human. Elinor Ostrom was awarded the Nobel Prize for economics, or the Sveriges Riksbanks Pris i ekonomisk vetenskap till Alfred Nobels minne, because it wasn't one of the prizes that Nobel himself created. In 2009, she was awarded the prize for a career in which she had diligently worked to prove Hardin wrong in terms that actually can be represented in the language that economists speak. And what she did was to demonstrate in economic terms the rationality and viability of traditional forms of self-governance. She showed that commons do not tend to end in tragedy. In her terms, the management of common pool resources does not require privatization or top-down public management by the state. Great. So, after Ostrom, even economists ought to be able to understand that the commons are not the recipe for disaster that Hardin claimed. But there's a second problem that comes in. Because Ostrom was working to make the commons visible in the way of seeing of mainstream economics, she talks about the commons as a pool of resources. And when the commons are seen and talked about in terms of resources, the most important things that the historical commons have to teach us go missing. In order to explain this, I need to bring in another person who thought and wrote a lot about the commons, a man called Ivan Illich, who had an extraordinary life. He began as a Catholic priest who eventually fell out with the Vatican. He wrote a series of books, and for a time in the 1970s he was extremely famous internationally as a radical thinker. Books like Deschooling Society and Tools for Conviviality. And then he kind of fell from view, but spent the last 25 years of his life going deeper into the history of how we came to think the way we do, how we came to see the world through these lenses that still dominate the way we talk about the world, our place within it, how we should be dealing with the mess the world is in. Many of the things that Uwe was talking to us about before. In 1982, in Japan, Illich gave a talk called Silence is a Commons. And in that talk, he describes the historical commons in the English landscape. He says, people called commons those parts of the environment for which customary law exacted specific forms of community respect. People called commons that part of the environment which lay beyond their own thresholds and outside of their own possessions, to which, however, they had recognized claims of usage, not to produce commodities, but to provide for the subsistence of their households. The customary law which humanized the environment by establishing the commons was usually unwritten. It was unwritten law not only because people did not care to write it down, but because what it protected was a reality much too complex to fit into paragraphs. The law of the commons regulates the right of way, the right to fish and to hunt, to graze, and to collect wood or medicinal plants in the forest. The enclosure of the pastures transformed the grassland from commons into a resource on which commercial flocks could be raised. Before, in any juridical system, most of the environment had been considered as commons from which most people could draw most of their sustenance without needing to take recourse to the market. After enclosure, the environment became primarily a resource at the service of enterprises which, by organising wage labour, transformed nature into the goods and services on which the satisfaction of basic needs by consumers depends. So where Ostrom and many of the people who are talking about the commons today talk about the commons as a way of managing a pool of resources, what Illich is saying is that a commons is not made up of resources. Resources is what you get after you enclose a commons, after you take it out of that means of owning and living with a place and a landscape. A commons was something that you could use for your own needs, the needs of your household, but not to get more than that in order to make money in the marketplace. And although economists of the mainstream variety have a lot of difficulty with grasping this, it's actually not very hard to grasp. If you stay in a hotel that has a breakfast buffet, a smorgasbord, you can help yourself to as much as you can eat from that, but you can't set up a table in the street outside and keep coming back to the buffet and taking food from the buffet, going outside and selling it to people passing down the street. It's not hard, it's common sense. But there is a way of seeing the world and a way of relating to the world which mainstream economics has promoted, which refuses to acknowledge the possibility that the world is not made of resources. And you see this very starkly often when the mining industry comes into a landscape and you have an industry which looks at a mountain and sees a pile of raw materials that can be traded on futures markets before they've even been taken out of the ground. And you have a community, and this could be in Sapmi, or it could be in the tribal areas of India, for whom that mountain is a god. Now, those are not the only two ways of seeing a landscape, but a lot of what has gone on in the era of industrial society has been about the collision between these two ways of seeing the world. Seeing the world as made of resources and seeing the world in other terms. So it may be possible, in order to prove Hardin wrong, to represent commons in terms of the management of resources, which is what Ostrom did. But something vital goes missing in that process. And Anthony McCann, my teacher, names this thing that goes missing as the heart of the commons. You've described the way in which people in this village manage and look after the land and deal with the issues that arise from sharing the land in terms which can be, which you can win, you can be awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics for. But the thing that mattered most about what was going on there is invisible in the description that you've come up with. And I would say that thing, the heart of the commons, is the different possibilities for being human together, which have been and continue to be embodied in the experience of a commons that is not made of resources. And somebody else who I learnt a lot from, Gustavo Esteva, a Mexican indigenous activist and intellectual, a friend of Ivan Illich, he said something very helpful to me about this. He said, if you want to understand and put into practice the commons today, especially in cities, especially in Europe, the place to start is with our friends. Friendship is perhaps the easiest starting point that we have in societies like ours for thinking about what it means not to treat the world as made of resources. My friends are not resources. However much Facebook might try and encourage us to see friendship as a thing which is about a total that you're accumulating. If someone I thought was a friend treats me as a resource, as something to be exploited, I'll say to my other friends, oh God, I feel used. And everyone knows what I mean. I don't have to go into this long, kind of complicated explanation about the history of economics that I've been giving you, because again, it's common sense. It's like the breakfast buffet. We don't actually have any difficulty in navigating this territory at the level of our everyday lives. So, I mean, okay, I've said that Hardin's description of what happens when a village shares a piece of common land where people can graze their sheep or their cattle, it's wrong. It doesn't match what we know from history, what we know from currently existing commons-like forms of land use in various parts of the world. So maybe he picked a bad example. Surely there are other examples which do match what Hardin was describing in The Tragedy of the Commons. And when people want to say that, they often say, well, look at the sea and fisheries and the disaster that we've made of the collapse of fisheries around the world. That's a classic case of what Hardin was talking about. If you want to see how, even in the case of fisheries, the actual story of how we arrived in the mess we're in is rather similar to in the case of the enclosure of the lands that were formerly held in common. There's a great book by another friend of mine, the Canadian environmental historian Dean Bavington. The book is called Managed Annihilation. It's about the double collapse of the Newfoundland cod fishery. And Dean is wonderful because he grew up in Newfoundland. He was the moment at which the fishery collapsed the second time was this traumatic event for the community that he was growing up in. So he's not just an academic coming in to study this from outside, but he's writing about stuff that is very deep in the bone for him in the lived experience of the community that he grew up in. And the story that emerges in his book is one of a fishery which in its earlier phases, if you go back 150, 200 years, fishing was an important part of the lives of the people in those communities in Newfoundland. It was part of a patchwork of different activities by which they produced or harvested things that met their needs as a community. Most of that activity took place outside of the market without money being involved in it. And there were years when the cod didn't come. There were years when the fish just weren't there when you went out to fish. And that would be a hungrier year than normal, but it wouldn't be a disaster because the fish were not the only thing that was part of your way of living. And it would be a very rare and strange year when all of the different harvests that made up the year failed at the same time. So people lived with the limits of their ability to control what you caught. The place where that became a difficulty was when you had money from elsewhere being invested in building factories where the fish could be processed and packed and taken elsewhere to sell for money. At that point, if you have a year when the fish don't come or there is a much smaller fish harvest than usual, that is a problem for the people who have invested their capital or borrowed money to invest in the factory. It's a problem in a new way that wasn't there within the vernacular way of living when the main purpose of catching fish was to feed people who lived in the village. Not only that, the people in the village are now working in the factory. They are no longer spending the time that they were growing other kinds of fruit and vegetables and having other activities that went together with fishing to make up the patchwork of their way of life. They've now become much more dependent on this industry of fishing that has been created, and as a result, it's not only the investors and factory owners who are affected when there is a bad year, but also the people who work on the boats and the people who work in the fish packing factory. And what happens then is that in order to try and take control of and improve the harvest from the sea, new technologies are invented that allow you to be more productive. And what more productive means is they allow you to intensify the exploitation of the fish. And at this point, the fish is being seen as a resource in a way that was not necessarily the case. And one of the most interesting bits in Dean's research is that he he found letters from fishermen at the point where this was happening, when new technologies were being brought in, where the fishermen were saying, this is going to end badly. There was a particular tool, and the first time I met Dean, he talked about this, and he passed one of these tools around the room, and we all held it in our hands. It's a really brutal, heavy-weighted piece of metal with a set of curving up spiked hooks. And he said, this was new 150 years ago, and what it did was, it meant that you could take fish out of the water that wouldn't come to the bait. You'd drop it in, you'd pull it up, and it would have torn into the side of fish and brought them up. And the fishermen said, this is not going to end well, because they knew that the pregnant fish don't eat the bait from the hooks. But once you start pulling the fish out with tools like this, and this is just the beginning of a journey that leads to the kind of drag nets that wreck the whole seafloor. But once you start doing this, you pull up the pregnant fish. And they had been living for generations with the fish as a living community with which their community was entangled. And again, it's common sense. If you start killing the pregnant mothers, then something is going to go wrong with the community of fish that your community's life is entangled with. But you're now in a situation where the resource view of the fish prevails. You're just thinking about the weight of fish. You're not thinking about the fish as living beings and living community. So, that's just a story, and perhaps one that has certain relevance to the history of parts of this country as well, about how it's not just the obvious example of the commons in the English historical sense, where Hardin's approach is misleading. It actually applies far more widely to a lot of the other things that within environmental thinking are talked about as commons and often as common pool resources. So, the people who promoted enclosure in England, people who promoted the process by which the law was used to steal the commons from villages and to give it to large landowners who could graze their sheep in order to make money, rather than the limited use primarily for the use of the household that was the tradition of commoning. The people who promoted this had a word for it. They called it improvement. Today, the word we would probably use is development. And by improvement, they meant increasing productivity, which, as I say, means intensifying exploitation. It tends to mean that. Now, Illich says, the law of the commons, the customary law which humanized the environment by establishing the commons, was usually unwritten. It was unwritten law not only because people did not care to write it down, but because what it protected was a reality much too complex to fit into paragraphs. Now, the improvers say, this is a tremendously inefficient, old-fashioned way of living with the land. We need to rationalize this. But the question is, for whom is it a problem that this reality is too complex to fit into paragraphs? And the answer is, for somebody somewhere else who wants to be able to think that they know what is going on. The history of enclosure is part of a history which is told by the radical geographer and political scientist James C. Scott as the creation of legibility. Something is legible, it's readable. And he says, in the journey into modern society, there was newly centralized systems of state management that wanted to manage and control what was going on through a huge territory and feel like they could see from above the whole story. And so you get things like the project of scientific forestry in Germany, which begins in the 1700s, which Scott discusses in a lot of detail, where you take a forest, this living complex thing, this community of beings with which human lives are intertwined, and you simplify it into 3 columns in a spreadsheet, so that somebody sitting in the prince's office in the city at the center of the region can think that they know what is going on in all of the forests that they own and control. And actually what happens is you then try and make the forest more efficient by planting trees in industrial rows, and instead of this increasing the productivity in the way that has been promised, within a lifetime or so you have an ecological collapse going on in the German forests, and gradually you have to develop more sophisticated means of forest management, which are really all about how can you take the forests back closer to being living, complex organisms rather than attempting to run a forest like a spreadsheet. And what Scott shows in his books is that if we look at history, rather than at the utopias of economic theory, it's grand projects like that, and not practices of commoning, that tend to end in ruin. The attempt to reform land under Mao in China in the 1950s and 60s is probably the largest and deadliest example of this, where you attempt to implement a top-down rationalization and modernization of processes and destroy the fabric of people's ways of living with the land and from the land. And actually what happens is millions and millions of people die. To see commons as resources is to think in the mindset and approach to reality of the enclosures. And now we're beginning to come around to the more immediate questions of the mess that the world is in and the ways in which we are responding to that mess and the green shift that we're talking about today. Because one of the dominant ways in which the mess the world is in is being dealt with is through the promotion of a total accountancy approach to this ecological situation. An approach which says, if we can measure and count and price everything, then we can fix it. The problem is that we're not counting the externalities and putting them onto the balance sheet. We need to put a value on everything so that we can put it into a spreadsheet and crunch that, and then through some combination of markets and state-like top-down management, we can rationalize this in a way which includes the ecological. It's the diagram that you had over where you have the ecological as the circle inside the circle of the economy, which is absolutely right as a description of the dominant approach. And what happens is that things like the UN Agenda 2030, those 17 Bærekraftsmål that were in the presentation that we saw at the start of this morning, get translated into local directives from above that forbid traditional practices in mountain valleys in Tibet. And so what is going on all over the world today is, in the name of environmental, sustainable development, the same kinds of processes of attempting to standardize, make legible, fit the world into spreadsheets are being applied with the same destruction of and disregard for the local knowledge and practices of things like commons, in the name of fixing the mess that the world is in. So, let's get serious about this. The pre-industrial commons of England were, on the whole, enclosed a long time ago. And we're sitting here in post-industrial Porsgrunn. It might be nice to tell stories about how people organised their ways of living differently in pre-industrial Europe. But we're deep in shit. The 6th mass extinction in the history of the planet is taking place right now. The Holocene, the 10,000 years or so of fairly stable, mild climate within which the whole of the history of that which we call human civilization has taken place. The Holocene is already ending. We don't know quite how things are going to play out with climate change, but even the best case scenarios are scary right now. Does it really help for me to come and take up your time talking about how economists have got it wrong about how people used to use land outside English villages 300 years ago? There are two answers to this, and the first answer is this is not just about things that happened in the past. The same processes of enclosure are going on today, mostly in other parts of the world. Only 30% of the world's food is produced within the agro-industrial system. 50% of the world's food today is produced by peasant farmers. Many, many of those people still have one foot inside something that looks like a commoning system. There are struggles against the resource-based view of reality taking place, I mentioned, in the context of mining. You have the same struggle taking place, whether it's in the tribal areas of India that Arundhati Roy writes about in Broken Republic, or whether it's in Sápmi in the north of Sweden. A struggle over whether the world is simply a set of resources to be exploited, or whether that's not an adequate representation of the world in which we find ourselves. If you think about NAFTA, and Donald Trump has reneged on it, but one of the strong points on which he was elected was his promise to tear up the trade treaty between the US, Canada, and Mexico that was brought in 1992. From a Mexican point of view, one of the strong elements of what NAFTA did was it led to the privatization of the ejido, which were a commons that had been recreated out of the Zapata rebellion earlier in modern Mexican history, inspired both by Spanish traditions of the ejido and by Aztec traditions of forms of commoning. So in 1992, in the name of globalization and economic development, the law was changed in Mexico, and one of the effects of that is that people have, in many parts of Mexico, poor people have lost their ability to grow their own food, and one of the effects of that is an increased level of illegal immigration to the United States, and also many of the issues around drugs and violence that Mexican society is torn apart by. So this stuff is not just about the history of what was done in a country like the one where I grew up 200, 300 years ago. It's live today, it's going on. And there are places where the struggle is pushing back in the other direction. In Chiapas, in Colombia, in Bolivia, you have places where large amounts of land have been taken back into common ownership on lines that draw on these traditions. So it's not inevitable that the commons is lost and lost for good. That's the first answer. But I have a second answer, which is where I want to end. We are taught to think about history as an irreversible progression, successive modes of production that replace their predecessors and render them obsolete. We talk about economic development in the way that the promoters of enclosure talked about improvement. We think of this kind of moving from one step to another, and that's the shape of history. And yes, it's true that time doesn't run backwards. You never go back to how things were before. And also that it would be foolish to wish to go back to any earlier state of affairs. There are things that have changed in the last few lifetimes that none of us would honestly choose to leave behind. However, it's not true that history works simply in that cumulative way that we tend to think about it. In many respects, history is more like a tide that rises and falls. Even today, there are parts of England where the commons have not been enclosed. One of the more unlikely best-selling books in the UK in the past 2 years is a book called The Shepherd's Life by a guy called James Rebank, which is a very powerful, beautiful, eloquent description of hill farming in parts of the north of England where he is a farmer himself, where they still have commons on the Fiel, and this is still part of their way of life. And one of the things he says in the book is, this industry has never been profitable enough for there to be capital invested in it from outside, and therefore you still have an economic form that does not respect the logic and values of modern economics, that is a living cultural practice by which people make a living today in the highest parts of the landscape in corners of England, Wales, and Scotland. And it's interesting that it's the mountains. James C. Scott, who I already mentioned, has a talk called Why Civilizations Can't Climb Hills. And you really can think of civilizations being a bit like the sea rising and falling. A growing civilization reaches further and further, and the places that it doesn't get to tend to be the wildest, most hilly places because they are the hardest to control. All over the world you get this. And states, empires, and civilizations expand and contract. The framing of the mess in which we find ourselves, the ways we talk about the mess the world is in, tends to go between two extremes. On the one hand, for 50 years we've been talking about saving the planet and the fragile Earth. So saying that the world itself is at stake. The world might come to an end. On the other hand, especially since the Brundtland Report in the 1980s, we move in the next sentence from talking about saving the planet to talking about sustainability, where sustainability means sustaining the current way of living of 1 in 7 of the people on the planet. And my suggestion is that it might turn out to be the case that what is at stake is somewhere in between the planet and our modern Western industrial way of life. That we may have passed the high tide of a civilization, which, with the help of fossil fuels and colonialism, climbed further up more hills in more corners of the world than ever before, but which is now breaking. The tide has broken and entered a disorderly and irregular retreat. If so, I didn't know it was going to do that. I'll hold you in suspense while I figure out how to stop it. Stop it by turning it off. There you go. This is the final paragraph. If so, the continued practice at the edges of other ways of living together and making life work that don't see the world as made of resources, along with its reinvention closer to the centre, starting from friendship, may yet make all the difference to how good or bad a job we make of living through the next few generations. Amitav Ghosh published a book last year called The Great Derangement, and right at the end of the book there's an extraordinary paragraph where he says, "The ever-shrinking time horizon of the climate crisis may itself be a source of hope in at least one sense. Over the last few decades, the arc of the Great Acceleration has been completely in line with the trajectory of modernity. It has led to the destruction of communities, to ever greater individualization and anomie, meaninglessness, and to the industrialization of agriculture and the centralization of distribution systems. At the same time, it has also reinforced mind-body dualism to the point of producing the illusion so powerfully propagated in cyberspace that human beings have freed themselves from their material circumstances to the point where they have become floating personalities decoupled from a body. The cumulative effect is the extinction of exactly those forms of traditional knowledge, material skills, art, and ties of community that might provide succour to vast numbers of people around the world, especially to those who are still bound to the land, as the impacts intensify. The very speed with which the crisis is now unfolding may be the one factor that will preserve some of these resources." Now, after what I've been saying, we might want to use a word other than resources, but the point he's making is an important one. If it looked like we were on a trajectory of uninterrupted industrial development, improvement, then we might truly arrive at a world of total enclosure in which all knowledge and practice of commoning were extinct, lost into history. But that's not the trajectory on which we find ourselves. And as things unravel, the seemingly anachronistic, the old-fashioned things surviving up in the mountains may yet make all the difference. But we need to take off the lenses which see the world as made of resources, or we won't even notice the possibilities for other ways of living together and making life work, which exist not as utopias of modernity, nor as a romanticized golden age, but as a messy practice of muddling through, a web of relationships too complex to fit into paragraphs or spreadsheets, which is closer to how people have made life work and found meaning in life in most of the times and places which humans have inhabited. Thank you.